Okay, so this is the seminar on policy analysis, and it's an introduction to administrations, providing kind of an overview. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Hopefully you have the PowerPoint in front of you so you can kind of follow along. So, we think about policy analysis. I think we first have to go ahead and talk a little bit about public administration, and then also kind of talk about public policy, and then from there I think we can actually sort of get to this notion of what policy analysis actually is. And this is kind of really providing you with an overview of some supporting information that might prove helpful to you as we're looking at policy analysis and you're reading along in your text. So again, you're following, you've got the PowerPoints in front of you and you're following along, so hopefully this will be helpful to you. So public administration really, when we think about it, it is both an academic discipline and it's a field of practice. So from that standpoint, what we're talking about then is what we mean is there is a scholastic component, a scholarship component to it, and there's sort of a real world component to it. Really, when we think about our discipline, it's really where theory does actually meet practice. I think that's kind of important, because along those lines then, we are preparing individuals to be civil servants who are acting in the public interest, and so that's extraordinarily important. And so our field of inquiry really then has a diverse scope, right? Really with an ultimate goal of advancing management and policies so that government can function and function really effectively, efficiently, economically, and with an eye towards social equity. I just hit the 4 pillars of our discipline there, but we'll touch on those in a little bit. So when we think about public administration, then we should also care really about this notion of public policy, what public policy actually is. Public policy actually can be defined quite broadly as any action or inaction of government, and government at whatever level. When we think about government, I think oftentimes we tend to think about the legislative bodies of government. We think about a city council, or we think about Congress, or we think about the state legislature, right? And then occasionally you may think about a governor, or you may think about a mayor, or you'll think about the president. But unelected officials in government, public managers, right, public sector managers and non-profit managers, right, are aspects of government. And when we think about public policy within that component of public administration, we really are talking about really the actions of public sector managers or non-profit managers, right, within that context, then, right? So when we think about public policy and the action or inaction of government chooses to do or not to do, we're really talking about what public sector managers actually choose to do or not to do. And because of that choice, whereas when we think about elected officials, they are creating, right, law, right, and through statutes, which are the outputs, but operating within the statutory authority, we also, by exercising our discretion, can create law. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I just want you to know that when we're thinking about public policy, ultimately we are thinking about, within our context, operating within those boundaries of discretionary authority that we have. So when we think about the impact of public policies, anything from the soda that you may be drinking right now to keep yourself awake, right, to the cost of this course that you paid, right, to varying things that impact your life, public policy really does shape the social and economic lives of everyone across this country. It's something to kind of keep in mind and be very cognizant of. And another thing that I think you should keep in mind is location does matter. Where we are matters. There is a variance in terms of how things are implemented, in terms of how decisions are made from state to state, from locality to locality. Although states may have some similar frameworks of governance, the implementation of things in terms of how things are actually implemented and how things are actually public policies are actually discerned or actually interpreted vary quite widely. So something to keep in mind there too as well. Another thing to kind of keep in mind is the fragmented nature, right, of our society. We have, when we think about public policy, there are over 89,000 different governments, so 89,000 different sort of rules that could apply depending on where you reside. And so ultimately then, again, when we think about public policy managers and non-profit managers, we really are thinking about the nature of policy implementation. We operate within that arena. We are implementing policy, we're exercising our discretion, right? And then we have to think that this leads to ultimately the question in terms of what does government do, right? And what should it do? What's appropriate really for government to do within a democratic society? And that brings up this notion or this nature of the different types of policies that are out there. Broadly defined, policies are either going to be distributive or redistributive. They're either going to require strong government intervention or interaction, or not much government interaction. It's going to require a lot of citizen participation, or it's going to require very little participation by citizens. It's going to require a lot of revenue, which is going to lead to a lot of taxes, or it's going to require very limited revenue, which would mean then that governmental services are going to be not very extensive. So when we think about the nature of what we do, it depends on where we are, what place we are, what space we are in, where we're located, and that also then can play a role when we think about location from state to state. There are some governments that are more redistributive, and there are some governmental situations that are more distributive, and so something to kind of keep in mind as a public sector manager or as a nonprofit manager. So factors that impact public policy. And again, we're exerting public policy, right, through our discretionary authority, but things that can impact that: constitutions, ideological tensions, the electorate, political culture, history, and social conflict. And so let's kind of delve into those just a little bit to kind of define those. And so you're following along, again, with me with your PowerPoint, and you're seeing that. Constitutions ultimately, right, are we live in a rational, legal society, so we're bounded by the rule of law, and so the ultimate sort of place where the rule of law actually sort of flows from in our society, that is the Constitution, the various state constitutions, the national constitution. Of course, there are charters that set out the guidelines, right, for municipalities and counties. So something to kind of keep in mind there. And so ultimately, constitutions are really a reflection of our collective values and our collective beliefs, and they do reflect the overarching political culture of the time. So another sort of thing to sort of look at, and think about, are these tensions that exist in policy making. Again, when we are exerting, again, I know you can apply this, and we tend to want to go back and look at this from the perspective of a legislative body or an executive body. But I think we need to go ahead and think about these tensions in policymaking when we're exerting our discretionary authority, right? That we are sort of being pulled to operate really either from a capitalistic perspective or more democratic perspective. Are we favoring private versus the public more? Is our system that we're operating in and we're making our decisions, are they based strictly on merit, or are we operating from the perspective of fairness? Are we operating as keepers of the public trust and being activist in nature, making sure that the things that we do, right, are front and center and out there, right, in society? Or are we more limited in our scope? Are we operating from an ideological perspective, right, from a more conservative bent or more liberal bent? Are we advocating really or looking at things from a culturally private perspective, right? Is that sort of one of the background sort of things we're thinking about? Or are we thinking about trying to promote multiculturalism or diversity? The thing to keep in mind here, though, is in looking at these dynamics, is that too much of any one of these could be a problem, right? You can really lean too much toward the capitalist perspective, but you can lean too much toward the democratic perspective, right? Because ultimately, when you try to be so inclusive, right, in decision making and democracy, right, then that means ultimately, right, that things tend to fall apart, it tends to fragment, and as an organization, your organization then really doesn't advance, it doesn't move forward because you can't make a decision, right? So something to kind of keep in mind from those perspectives, and you can have, again, similar sort of issues, right? As far as you're not as dynamic of an organization if you only have one type. If you're looking at all men or all a certain ethnicity, right, that could be a problem. But if you could have too much multiculturalism, right? You could have so many different backgrounds, so many different perspectives, right, coming from so many different sort of arenas that it's hard to define, your organization, your organizational culture to get things sort of going. So there are some issues on being too much of either one of those is what I'm trying to say on that scale. So moving on to the electorate, ultimately keep in mind that whatever we do, and this is really looking at the electorate from the standpoint of participating. It says in terms of registered voters and given a geographic locale, and that's really sort of addressing this issue from a political perspective. But from a public sector management perspective, something to kind of keep in mind is that we are answerable to the public, not in the sense like our elected officials in terms of via election, but ultimately we operate within the public interest. And it's important for us to go ahead and promote this notion of efficacy for the people that we serve. And I think that's really, really important to kind of keep in mind. So then we move on a little bit and we think about political culture, and what that is really sort of saying is ultimately, right, it does define the political culture of an area, it defines the expectations, right, as it relates to the role of government should do or not do, how we should choose to act. And then of course history does play a role in terms of where we operate and what we do, the dynamics of an organization, their traditions, the habits, the previous commitments that have been made. So we don't make decisions in a vacuum. There is this history, right, that permeates and surrounds what we do now in the here and now. And then the nature of social conflict or identity politics, right? We can talk about that we have to go ahead and think about and view, right, the tensions that exist in terms of when we're making our decisions, right, that are there based on gender, sexual orientation, class, location, ethnicity, race. So it's important to kind of be cognizant and understanding of what's going on. And so this is really kind of providing you, I think, hopefully, ideally, really with a background perspective, an environment in terms of when we're making decisions, when we're serving the public, when we're operating in the public interest, what's important. And so then, we kind of move on then to look at these theoretical frames, and these are techniques that we can utilize. And they're based around this notion of a reference point or a model. It gives us a perspective or a way of kind of understanding things a little bit better. They're not 100%. They're not 100% accurate. They're not all encompassing, but I think they're useful tools to kind of keep things in mind in the back of your head, again, on our journey to understand public administration, public policy, and ultimately policy analysis. So this is giving you just a little teeny weeny little bit, right, of a preview and overview of what I think you kind of need going into looking at the Barbeck text and then ultimately looking at the Dunn text. So the theoretical frames in which we will touch on very briefly: David Easton's systems theory, cyclic theory, the iron triangle, and Lazar streams of political culture. So let's go right into Easton's systems theory, and we think about Easton's systems theory ultimately then, right, as the authoritative allocation of values and capital. Now, I can tell you that Easton, and I love that phrase, and he was defining really, politics, right, when he was defining the authoritative allocation of values and capital, but I think it's a really good way of framing and looking at public policy. Because public policy is any action or inaction of government, what government chooses to do or not to do. And so ultimately, within our context of being public sector managers, it's what we choose to do or not to do, operating within the statutory authority that defines, right, that defines ultimately the agency or the organization, right. But then there are some organizational sort of norms that also kind of define what we do. But we are operating there. This notion of allocating our values in our capital, and so this model basically says that there's a problem associated with an interest group, and they're placing a demand, right, on policymakers to go ahead and resolve this issue. Within this context, the law has already been in place, funds have been allocated, and now it's up to us to go ahead then, right, the policymaker at the local level to go ahead and implement those services. When we think about the nature of education and in Tennessee, the Tennessee Board of Regents has ultimately some authority there. There is some statutory authority from the state legislature in terms of giving us some guidelines and some funding and that kind of thing. And so then the University of Memphis then goes ahead and has its guidelines, and ultimately as it relates to this class, for example, policy analysis. And so then it's up to me then as the frontline implementer of public policy to go ahead then and address interest group, being you, the student, in terms of to meet your demands in terms of taking this course and to educate you as it relates to issues related to policy analysis. And so we have different outputs that are coming out of that. There are dozens of different texts that we could utilize, right, for policy analysis. We picked two. We picked the Bardock text and we picked the Dunn text, right? So we're using those two. So that's one of the things we could have used a number of other different things. We could have met every day or once a week. We're actually going to meet, right, basically once a month, right? We're going to go out. I'll see you, face to face. We could have a different sort of assessment criteria. Right now, we're being you guys are being assessed, right, with a midterm and a paper and some discussion board posts and maybe one mini project. That's it. We could have done it a different way. But the point is and again, as the public sector manager, operating within at the local level, implementing, narrowly, exercising my discretion here, there are some outputs, right? And as the students being the interest groups here, right, you're going to provide some feedback, ideally, right, in terms of how things went. Hopefully you'll have great feedback in terms of saying that everything went well. It may not have. Maybe you'll say that there are some opportunities for improvement. We could do a different way. But the point being is that this is a cycle, right, that sort of goes. And so based on your feedback then, this could change a little bit. So this could lead to changes, right, in how this class is implemented, which could create, which basically your feedback could be viewed as new demands, and so the cycle repeats all over again. So I think this is kind of a good illustration. It's not perfect, but it gives you perspective in terms of how things sort of operate and how a public sector manager can operate at the local level. Other things to kind of keep in mind a little bit, different filters that the policymaker, the frontline implementer may have, based on the location, based on history, based on ideology. There's some things that keep in mind in terms of the type of supports that you as an interest group may have, your level of expertise, how on the same page you are with your fellow students, what type of leadership you actually have, and how much money you actually maybe have. Money in this example may not actually carry any weight, but I think it's important to keep in mind that those are things that could carry weight depending. So then we go to cyclic theory, which is basically saying that we need to be cognizant as public sector managers of the legislative cycle, the bureaucratic cycle, the budgetary cycle, and of the media cycle. So the things that we do, we need to be cognizant of. A brief example, the budgetary cycle would be that, I'm allocated a certain amount of money. The department has a certain amount of money to, let's say, for research, for conferences, for travel, for student-oriented functions, right? And so I didn't need to be cognizant of the budgetary cycle. If I'm going to utilize those types of things, I need to plan those things out well in advance and maybe get things sorted in October or November or December, and not sort of think that I can push things off, right, until July of the following year. That could be an issue as it relates to budget there. So something to kind of keep in mind. And so then we've got the Iron Triangle, which is basically looking at, and as it says, interest group, Congress, and bureaucracy, but let's pull this down to the local level. And ultimately, right, what we're talking about here is a relationship that exists between a legislative body of elected officials, right, agencies of unelected officials, and then interest groups, or ultimately the public. So really, if we want to apply this model to our own situation or circumstances, we're looking at the relationship that exists between elected officials, unelected public sector managers or nonprofit managers, right, and the public. That's ultimately what it's talking about, right? So it's talking about that. For our purposes, it's talking about that in general. So elected officials and unelected officials, right, according to our kind of revised model here, would be that political support and funding for that elected officials provide for unelected officials. In exchange, then we would provide the execution of policies by exercising our discretion, right? And we're going to implement those policy choices that the elected officials think are important. And then, as it relates to the public in unelected agencies, right? Unelected managers, and there is sort of this notion of it says lobbying, but we're talking about but maybe advocating. The public is advocating for certain things, and then maybe the agencies are providing those things. So it's not a perfect sort of translation, but I think it's something that I think can at least help you sort of think about the nature between elected officials, unelected officials, and then the public ultimately. So it's not perfect, but I think it's something that bears mentioning. And then finally, the other sort of model that we touch on a little bit here is Lazar's streams of political culture, which is basically saying that depending, right, on the part of the country you're in, right, there are sort of different cultures, right. There's a difference between what happens and what's been, as far as resources are concerned. Let's say it relates to education in New York versus Tennessee. Right, there is a difference. There's a difference that relates to taxation policies in New York, right, versus Ohio versus Tennessee. And according to Lazar identified sort of three streams of political culture: moralistic, with a focus on tomorrow, making the world a better place for our children and our grandchildren; individualistic, with a focus really on today; and then traditionalistic, with a focus on yesterday. And it's interesting to me, anyway, the current occupant of the White House. It seems like a lot of his support is of the traditionalistic sort, and it's just interesting. Another sort of way of looking at moralistic, individualistic, and traditionalistic also is to look at this through the lens of rural versus suburban and urban. So with rural being traditionalistic, suburban being individualistic, and urban being moralistic. It's another way of kind of patching, looking at it and classifying it. Which again, then this ultimately then in this conversation, I think we'll close on. I want to close it with the four pillars of our discipline. The National Association of Public Administrators have identified four pillars of our discipline that we should kind of keep in mind and be cognizant of as public administrators and as non-profit managers. The nature of efficiency, economy, effectiveness, and social equity. And so I think this is a useful bridge to think about some of the things that we've talked about in this lecture, and it'll actually bridge things that we're going to go into the next lecture. So hopefully this has been helpful to you. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to shoot me an email or post a comment on the discussion board. And having said that, go forth and conquer, and I'll talk to you soon.